Welcome to the Databricks Skill Builder series. We're glad you're here.
Okay, so let's go ahead and kick it off. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We'll be covering CI/CD with GitHub Actions and Databricks today. This is the agenda. So we'll do a quick introduction of Robbie and myself. We'll talk very high level about what CI/CD is, just to make sure that everyone understands what we're talking about. Then we'll go into GitHub Actions, describe what that is, the components of an action. We'll talk about DBX, which is how we're going to integrate with Databricks and Databricks Workspace. And then Robbie will take over and do a demo at that point. One quick thing, if you guys can use the Q&A for questions. So at any point, if there's a question, go ahead, use that. And we'll be trying to answer that throughout the webinar. All right, so a little bit about me. My name is Eric Tomei. I'm a Databricks Solutions Architect. I'm based out of Austin, Texas. Formerly from IBM, and then way back, if you go back far enough in my career, it's Rational Software. I spent the last 20 plus years in software development and architecture, primarily in the data space. My last job, my last role at IBM was really as a senior data engineer, focused on both data warehousing as well as data engineering with Spark and Scala, running all of that in Docker and Kubernetes. Obviously, before I got exposed to Databricks and was able to use our awesome product. So let me pass it over to Robbie, and he can introduce himself.
Sure, thanks, Eric. Hey, everybody, welcome. My name is Robbie Kiskanian, Solutions Architect. I'm lucky enough to have worked with Eric in the past, also at IBM, where we worked on a lot of distributed applications with Spark and Scala, and we had a lot of fun doing that. Currently helping our customers leverage the platform. My career spans almost more than 10 years at this point, working with software development tailored specifically to data. I started my particular journey using a lot of Python and Pandas, like a lot of you may have done so as well. And the two things I enjoy the most tend to be the experiences that we can create for end users, whether it's a data scientist or a data engineer. Looking forward to showing the audience here how you can leverage GitHub Actions to deploy a full CI/CD process using Databricks.
Awesome. Thanks, Robbie.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start off again, just high level, make sure that everyone here understands what we're talking about. So, what is CI/CD? CI/CD stands for continuous integration and continuous delivery. And really, it's a way to automate software development workflows, both from a developer's perspective as well as in the deployment phase. The goal of it is to essentially deploy better quality code by doing things like linting, which is checking to make sure that you're writing your code in a way that produces quality code. Running unit tests to make sure that whatever you deploy doesn't break anything that's already in production. Integration tests is another part of that, to make sure that at a systems level, everything is functioning the way that it should. And really, it's to basically improve the deployment of software, right? And this can be done in Databricks, and it can be done in a number of different ways. Today, we're going to primarily focus on GitHub Actions, but when you look at the CI/CD workflow on Databricks at a high level, there's a couple of personas that are at work here. So one is going to be essentially some type of admin. This could be a DevOps guy, it could be CloudOps, depending upon what makes sense for your organization. But they're going to be working in a couple of different ways. So one is they're going to be using the product to set up these things called repos. That's a functionality in Databricks that allows you to essentially clone something like a GitHub repository into Databricks and start using that code within Databricks. They would be responsible for something like that. And then the other side of that is the automation that would be created in GitHub. And this would be using something like GitHub Actions, which is the main focus of the call today. We'll primarily be looking at the admin workflow today, but I do want to talk about the user workflow just so that everyone understands a typical workflow on Databricks. There's a couple of ways to do this, right? So one, you can work directly with the Databricks UI, or you could work with an IDE. Regardless of which path you choose, you would essentially be cloning your repo. You'd be creating a feature branch to work off of your main branch. you'd write some code, you'd edit the code, you go back and forth, creating some commits. And then when you're ready, you would do a push to your remote branch, and this would trigger some sort of action, right? At this point, we're now in the GitHub space where we're leveraging the automation that we built to produce quality deployment. When someone is ready to do a full deployment, they do a pull request. You'd have some sort of technical, senior technical person reviewing that code, making sure that the code looks good. That would be merged into the main branch. And then there's an automation that kicks in that would essentially push this code into production. It would push your production artifacts into a Databricks workspace. You could potentially stop running jobs, update their code, restart them. So that's, at a high level, what the workflow looks like in Databricks. But now let's talk about GitHub Actions. That's the main focus of the talk today is, there's a number of different type of Git repositories that you can use. But today the focus is GitHub. So one of the things that we're going to be using is an action, and this is a way to enable all of that automation. And the nice thing about an action is they're highly customizable. So really, I've worked with many organizations now here at Databricks. Everyone does CI/CD a little bit differently. Some have very light CI/CD processes. Some have some heavy, extremely automated processes. They come from a strong software engineering background. So we see kind of the full range of those types of deployments. And the nice thing is that you can customize this for your own needs. But really, it's just a way to enable this customization. You can leverage other actions within your workflow to essentially make things easier for you. And it's a pretty good tool, and it works pretty seamlessly with Databricks. So let's break down the components of an action and what they look like. So overall, you have something called a workflow. And a workflow is just an encapsulation of that automation. That workflow can get triggered by specific events. It could be something like a push whenever you're pushing code into a repo. It could be a release where you're actually releasing code into a production environment. There's different types of events that could trigger this. Within your workflow, you're going to be running things like jobs and actions, right? So an action could be is essentially like a bundle of work. It could be something like checking out a repo or setting up an environment. And the jobs are going to essentially be like step-by-step commands in a command line. That's something that is going to be executed to make sure that this automation is running and works. All of this gets run in something called a runner. If you're using just public GitHub, those runners are typically just VMs, just Azure VMs that are up and running that get spun up. This code gets run in them. You could also set up a separate server that would manage all of your runners as a separate process. There's two different ways to do that. But when you look at an action, it's really defined by a YAML file. And this is a very simple example of what that YAML file could look like. And I'll walk through each of these and point out what those different components are. So first off, we have is just our name. In this case, it's just CI pipeline. This is really defining the overall workflow. Then we need to define the event that triggers this workflow. In this case, this is going to be a push, and it's going to kick in for any branches that receive a push, except for branches that have a tag that starts with V. And this is going to be used for our release deployments. Then we have an encapsulation of all the jobs that are being run. And those are being run on a particular runner. In this case, it's going to be just an Ubuntu VM. The other thing we want to think about here is the environment. I know Robbie's going to go into a lot of detail here about how this actually works, but we need a couple of things to be able to interact with the Databricks workspace. We need the host, and then we need our token. And these are two secrets that are stored within GitHub. So this is in the GitHub environment where we're defining these. But the host is really just your workspace URL essentially, and then the token is going to be like a personal access token that you can set up through your settings within your workspace. Next on here is going to be a couple of things to kind of set up this VM so that we can start using it to do, for example, unit tests in this case. The first thing we need to do is check out our code onto the VM. That's what this action does. the next action is going to be used to set up a Python environment. So we're going to focus on a Python project. And so we need Python on the VM in order to run these commands. So a few things now is just basically just the jobs that are going to run after we have all our environment set up and our workflow is triggered. You know, what actually happens? It's these steps here. So we're just doing a pip install. We're actually installing dependencies to do our unit testing locally. And this last command is just running PyTest, and it's running on all the unit tests that are in this particular folder from our repo. So that's a really simple explanation of what's going on within our Git Action YAML. We have some more complex examples that Robbie's going to walk through and show how we can use this to integrate with Databricks. Now, how does that actually work, right? So when you think about that integration point, so what is the actual command that we run to enable this integration? There's a few ways to do this. The way that we've chosen to show you is with DBX. This is probably by far the simplest way to do it today. And DBX is the Databricks CLI extension. It comes out of a Databricks Labs project, and it's essentially an abstraction layer on top of the Databricks CLI that simplifies how you use the Databricks CLI, but also adds in additional functionality that can be used for CI/CD processes, for example. Some of the things that you can get with it are bootstrapping a Python project. So you can actually go, after you've installed the Databricks CLI, you've configured it, you have DBX installed, you can run this DBX init command to actually create a bootstrapped simple Python project that will give you the framework that you can then build out, one, your Databricks code, and then two, all of the integration points like some unit tests, integration testing, as well as some default GitHub Actions that would be within this. So really cool way to just quickly kind of get up and running and not have to build all this stuff out yourself. So, what happens when an event is triggered? And, I did mention earlier that you can use the Databricks UI or an IDE. And so these events get triggered really no matter what interface you're using. It's really what matters is that, that push into the repository, for example, or that release that needs to take place. So we'll be going over two types of triggers today. One is going to be an on push. We did talk a little bit about this before when we went over the YAML, but these are the types of things that can happen within your GitHub action when you do a push, right? So one, we'd install the CI dependencies. We could run the unit tests. Then we would potentially run those integration tests. At this point for integration testing, we're really looking at like systems integrations and making sure that systems work well together. And that actually requires a call out to a Databricks workspace. So unit tests are always run locally, either on your local development machine or within that GitHub Actions VM. But integration tests require reaching out to some sort of system and test to make sure everything works well together. And then you could do things like, linting, code coverage, all those can be built into the action. So you get a good idea of code health, as well as coverage percentage for your particular project. The other type of workflow that we're going to be looking at is an on release. And so in this case, we're going to do things a little bit differently. At this point, this should be triggered essentially when we're doing something like after we've done a pull request and code's been merged into our main production branch. Now we want to deploy this code into production. What we're doing here is we're going to deliver some artifacts into the Databricks workspace. We're going to stop workflows. We're going to deploy the new workflows pointing to the new code, and then we're going to start things back up again. So that's typically what goes on with an on-release workflow. Okay, so hopefully now everyone has a good idea of how this works at a high level. I'm going to pass this over to Robbie, and he's going to walk you through a demo and show you exactly how this works. So take it away, Robbie. Let me stop sharing.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Eric. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so let's make this a little bit of a reality when it comes to how do you actually apply these DevOps concepts. You should see a black screen in front of you. Hopefully you do. What we'll do is we're going to start with a really, really simple demonstration of really what DBX gives you out of the box. The goal here, like Eric said, is to depending on where you are. Sure. Okay. So I think just to pick up where we may have dropped. So we're gonna start with DBX as your starting point. And what I was trying to say was that if you think about the options out there to essentially interface with a CI/CD pipeline, clearly you can think of your standard deployment frameworks, whether it's Jenkins, whether it's GitHub Actions. All of that is kind of doing a similar concept when it comes to creating that pipeline of pushing, testing, deploying. It's all very similar. I think in this case, we're trying to really simplify that exercise against Databricks by leveraging DBX. And just the way to think about DBX is it's almost like this middle sweet spot between, I'd say, a full-blown Terraform, infrastructure as codes templating service versus even going down to the Databricks CLI level. And it's probably the best option right now available if you wanted to generate these jobs and workflows and definitions in Databricks itself. So let's get started. So what we're gonna do is let me just split my screen for a second. Let's take a look at what DBX does for you in the first place. So if I were to, for example, call a command already part of the package library, you can specify your respective cloud. You can specify the project name. In this case, I'm simply using a standard set of flags, and I'm also making sure that it gives me GitHub Actions. What you're doing here, if I were to run this, is essentially telling DBX to give you the appropriate scaffold, right? And so if I were to open this up, you get the idea. It's a nice way to help you with getting started quicker. You don't have to spend time creating all of this boilerplate. And just to point out a few important files here, we've got a configuration directory, and probably the most important file happens to be this deployment file. And this is an example of what you get from the beginning of executing and initializing the DBX. We're going to go over much more of what that looks like with the demonstration. You'll notice also, of course, we have our YAML templates. And again, something that just gives you a starting point for getting started with a CI/CD process against Databricks. So let's go ahead and close that up. Let's go back to our project itself. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill down into how this DBX deployment configuration file ends up becoming part of that GitHub Actions pipeline. The main things to call out, DBX is pretty comprehensive, but for this purpose, let's call out how it knows about the different environments. Clearly, we care about the environment isolation here. So if I, for example, in this case, I simply tweaked my configuration file to say use a dev key for these respective workflows, okay? I'm simply naming that workflow, and just to keep it simple, I have a task which essentially points to, in this particular case, it happens to point to a Python wheel application, all being driven by a setup file and very, very standard boilerplate when it comes to Python development. So what I want to focus on is how this becomes part of CI/CD, though. So I'm telling it to utilize these individual code files within this particular task, and I'm also telling it to use these code files within the development key. And just to go down this process, I also have of course, a secondary isolation in the form of a staging, and all that also is going to help us define the integration testing within staging. And of course, we have a prod. And this will all make sense as I go through this example, but what the GitHub Actions is going to obviously do in the way I've defined it, let's take a look at that now. When we think about that push trigger that Eric was mentioning, what we're doing is essentially simply calling, after we do our testing, we're calling that development workflow. So just to back up for a moment and think about how conceptually, CI/CD is supposed to sort of help. It's supposed to help orchestrate your full integration, which will involve unit testing, integration testing to different resources. In this case, I'm reaching out to a Databricks warehouse. And then, of course, you can do anything you want in the development phase of that trigger. Once you complete that, let's say the CI/CD process completes that initial testing, then of course you get into a release. And that's the idea. You want to make sure you've got a process which really guarantees and either does it through linting, either does it through unit testing. It shouldn't encompass all of those. But at the end of the day, it's supposed to release to production. And let's see what that means when it comes to the DBX though. So as far as what I'm doing in this particular example is we're going to lint. We're going to use a package, of course, that's pretty common in Python, which is called Black. Black is part of my dependencies here because I have it already defined as a package within my setup in Python. You notice I'm not using any kind of pip install here. And then we're doing a unit testing call, of course, and this is nothing more than a simplified unit test class that simply mocks up some data and just helps me go through this exercise of testing something. So let's drop back into the push. Once we go through those initial steps, we want to essentially run this integration test, of course, along with the development workflows, which I've defined in my deployment file, which I showed on the Databricks environment. And that's as easy as calling the dbx deploy command, followed by the workflow, followed by that particular key. Now, that key, of course, is important because in this particular YAML definition for GitHub Actions, it tells it which workflows to execute. And furthermore, I've already defined which environment and workspace this should be executed against. So you get a lot of granularity that you can apply by combining the benefits of DBX deployment configurations, along with letting GitHub Actions define where those get executed when you start your CI/CD process. When I go through that initial, in this case, I've decided to run the code itself against, let's say, a development environment by simply pointing to that development flag. And then I finish this off when it comes to the actual push process by running the integration test. Now let's talk about what's happening here really quickly. I'm using now the staging flag, right? So if I were to open up that deployment file, and if you kind of follow this concept of how DBX can nicely separate out and isolate these different workflows, these different Python files, you can even specify your cluster configurations. It's just a nice way to really abstract away all of the things that you would potentially have to do manually. For example, with the Databricks CLI and calling the R APIs, DBX will do that for you by simply organizing your workflows in this way, putting them within their respective environments, right? And then the push for GitHub Actions will know exactly which parts to execute from your deployment file. In this case, I'm calling the workflows definition. And you'll notice here that I'm actually including a flag which tells it to not define a full job on Databricks. And let's see what that means exactly. So let's do this. Let's drop into our Databricks environment for a moment. Let's go into our workflows. Let's go to our jobs. And if I look for my particular one, there may be a lot in here that already got triggered, but let's do this. Let's do owned by me. You'll notice here that there's an untitled, and you'll notice that there was a run executed, which is exactly what I just showed when I was showing you that integration test driven by my push process, my push trigger. So when I, in fact, tell it to do an assets only, it's not defining the job, it's only using the cluster, and it's going to be rendered within the actual job runs as opposed to the job workflows. When I execute this integration test, you want to make sure you call another flag because you're referencing that original assets only. And this way you can complete that initial cycle of integration testing, unit testing. You can, like I'm doing in this case, I'm even switching environments based on my particular preferences. And I'm also, of course, completing the hygiene of unit testing as well as my linting. So all of this is meant to satisfy all of those conditions that you should have in some form when it comes to your integration process. Now, what I didn't go over, which let me go over really quickly, is when you look at the deployment file once more, and we go back to this isolation for development, what's really neat about DBX is it gives you a lot of flexibility working locally. So what that means is this. It also comes with a file called project.json whenever you initialize DBX. Let me explain what's happening here. You notice I have a key here called dev. That key is what maps directly to the deployment file. Not to get confused with what CI/CD and GitHub Actions is doing, but what this essentially means is that if I have in my profile, and that profile, for example, would look like this. If you've worked with Databricks enough, you know that it's pretty important to have this, this configuration file sitting on your machine, and this allows you to essentially point to any workspace using your host and tokens. I can easily have anything I want in here and in the same exact syntaxes. But you get the idea. The project essentially ties back to your Databricks configuration file sitting on your machine. And you get to essentially associate those individual environments within deployment that I showed between dev, staging, and prod. You get to associate them with those profiles coming from Databricks config. So just something to keep in mind if you were to essentially use DBX to test locally. There's a lot more you can do. For example, if you looked at the help, it's just essentially a really neat feature where you can execute on an all-purpose cluster and test that way. But just wanted to call that out in the meantime. Okay, let's close it up. Let's now take a look at what happens when, in fact, I go through this CI/CD process using that push, and let's see what it looks like on Databricks. So do you remember that development workflow that I executed, that I wanted to execute part of my push? If I were to go now back into my UI for Databricks, you'll notice here's my workflow. And now you get the rendering of that definition in the form of a official standard jobs API specification, simply because I didn't add the flag for assets only. And you get to track this in Databricks. You start maybe understanding that once I tell GitHub Actions to run this particular part within my push trigger. And the push trigger, of course, can be anything. Even when you do a PR, you'll get that executed as one scenario. And this basically gets triggered nicely as a set of whether you either dependent tasks or completely independent ones. This essentially becomes rendered in the Databricks UI.
Hey, Robbie,
The integration,
it looks like on GitHub, just a kind of a workflow.
What was the question, Eric?
Can you also show what that looks like on GitHub?
Of course. So let's go into our repo. Let's go into our actions. Okay, so let's focus now on the pipeline, because this is this integration part. You'll notice here, this is where I executed that individual trigger. So to recap what happened here, I think this is kind of probably what gets a little confusing maybe, but as a developer, I'm creating a feature branch. Let's say, for example, I push that feature branch. Let's say I have a trigger in GitHub Actions to trigger from that push. It's going to essentially kick that whole DBX process off. It's going to go through that linting that I was mentioning. And then guess what? When it gets to the part where it deploys, which is what you saw within the GitHub Actions, it's then going to simply create this pipeline, and of course, then connect and trigger that on Databricks. Hopefully that sequence of events makes sense when it comes to the integration, right? So we've got push, we've got CI/CD, we've got the CI from GitHub Actions, we've got the linting, we've got the deploy in two forms. We've got the deploy with the job definition, and we've got the deploy even without the job definition for the purposes of integration testing. That is a really nice sort of series of events to encapsulate the first part of the CI/CD process. So now what happens when you go through that first part and you're ready to push? Okay, we've gone over the push mechanism. Let's take a look at the release. And then, as Eric mentioned, these can be customized in any shape or form that you wish. In this case, for example, we're telling it to go to production, assuming you've gone through the initial testing components. You could tag this with a version, and you push those tags up, and then GitHub Actions knows what to do at that point. It knows that, okay, you're ready to push this and become production. And you're probably already familiar by now in terms of what's happening, because we're defining the host and the token within GitHub Actions and making that variable available. Because of that, DBX knows where to point to. So now it's really nice to see how you can have a lot of control when it comes to your cluster targets, your cluster spec targets, I should say, within the deployment file, and also your Databricks workspace targets. In this case, I'm simply creating a secondary host within secrets, and I'm installing dependencies, and I'm doing my full-blown production workflow, right? So if I were to go back to deployment, and let's backtrack now to back to prod, we simply have a very similar set of tasks. In this case, it's a little more complicated, where I'm using this workflow. And furthermore, I'm defining a dependency between my two tasks. This happens to be a common pattern between ETL and downstream machine learning operations. And it's still going to use my particular Python application, and of course, I need to point to, in this case, it just happens to be this particular workflow within the prod environment, and you get the idea. I were to go to my releases, now this will hopefully start making sense. I'm telling DBX to do the exact same thing I did with the push, but this time I'm using a different flag, and I get to customize it. So I get to say, please use the prod definitions I've created in deployment and run that full set of workflows. It's going to generate the entire definition for me on Databricks, and it's going to happen on this workspace. And to make it a little more crystal clear, here's what happens. If I go to jobs, and if I basically look at the ones that I created, you'll notice here, there's a prod. And I haven't had to create any kind of JSON payload to feed into Databricks CLI. And it's basically all being generated automatically by DBX simply as a function of what I've defined. Once I go through that final release, right, in my CI/CD process, it's going to generate those respective workflows. And it's going to go through the full production process. And of course, remember I mentioned this multitask interdependent set of interdependency within the workflow. It now executes this within the production environment. And because of how we've defined that release to be triggered off of tags, that's very straightforward, right? You essentially could tag this like this. I can say I make this a 7, right? Let's say I made this to be a push. I think I have a nice helper in here. Let's say I've then pushed my tags, right? Now, because of the way the trigger is defined within releases, it's going to know to essentially run that mechanism. I think we should be able to see that. You see here, it's basically getting queued up to be executed. So that's a very simple way to potentially get started with using GitHub Actions, basically leveraging DBX to give you that helping hand when it comes to defining your jobs. Don't get too caught up necessarily with the rest of these definitions. What the most important thing here is to really understand all the relationships between the Python application, right? So in this case, for example, I have a very simple Python application that's simply going to be packaged as a wheel. And thanks to DBX, it knows how to package that wheel. It knows how to look at my setup file. I didn't call too much attention to this because this doesn't have to be in this particular style. It can, as long as it's a Python task or a wheel application with dependencies, all of that is able to be consumed by DBX very easily. And all of that is very nicely organized within your deployment configuration file, within individual isolated environments, very customizable, even within individual job cluster specifications. And we also showed how a GitHub Actions push can be very easily defined to leverage the primary DBX commands of deploy and launch using any kind of environment defined within deployment, using even a jobless state, or using a stateful job definition, right? In general, you don't want to necessarily create full-blown job definitions for integration testing. So you can make those to be assets only. They get pushed up to Databricks nonetheless, and they get executed on Databricks. And we also showed how you can also then very easily define another environment altogether for your final production deployment. Once you've completed the testing, you've completed the integration, you've gone through that exercise of proper hygiene, you can then simply define GitHub Actions to very similarly execute now against a prod isolation. I can even point to a different deployment file. And we saw how that becomes rendered not only in GitHub Actions from your repository, you see the release is getting kicked off now, but that gets very nicely rendered and tracked, of course, in the form of workflows, all within Databricks. This is my development workflow, which I executed. And that was, of course, followed by the production workflow. And you'll see here that the release was what triggered this particular workflow. So a really nice way to visualize and sort of see this end to end, all the way from an individual developer's workstation all the way to, what could be a very complicated and sophisticated CI/CD process. Thank you for paying attention. I will stop right there.
Awesome. So thanks, guys. Looks like we don't really have any questions. So just thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you at some other point. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.